Okay, I'm going to start with the question that we had last week. If you remember, Carrie, is that how I pronounce your name?
Yeah, but I have to try to remember the question.
I know the question. I know the question. Okay, so the question was, we were saying that God constantly has to recreate us, right? Something from nothing, because if he didn't will us to exist, we wouldn't exist. And the question was, well, don't we know that God created the world through speech, and 6 days he created the world, and the seventh day he rested? So how is it that Hashem is creating us, but on Shabbos he rests, right? It feels like a contradiction. So it happens to be a super excellent question that it wasn't like it took some research, and this answer is a good start. I don't think it answers all of the question. I think but it gives us what to think about. And what I was able to between me asking a few people, what I was able to find out was that basically Hashem created the world through speech. And on the seventh day, God rested, creating the world through speech. But through thought in his mind, we are still being created in Hashem's thought, which is Hashem's will. So through speech, which is a very big revelation, and we said speech is like a expression of something that wasn't known before. That does not happen on Shabbos, but we are still being recreated through the mind. Now, and it does make sense because on Shabbos we know that everything is elevated, right? One second, let me just mute everybody. Okay, so we're not supposed to talk about mundane things on Shabbos, right? Our speech is supposed to be elevated on Shabbos, and our connection and our spiritual experience is much more elevated on Shabbos as well, because everything is coming from the mind, which is from a deeper place than speech, which is a more of an outward expression. So that's the answer that I was able to find. I still think that we're still being created, but we're being created only through Hashem's thought, not through Hashem's speech, which gives Hashem basically on the seventh day, he rested from creation through speech. Okay, so that's what we have for the answering to question last week. Let's jump right into this week. We have a lot to cover, but it's a really great chapter. And we are now on chapter 23. Okay, so we have been spending a lot of time discussing this non-dual idea of Hashem, that everything is absorbed with and consumed by the presence of Hashem, right? We've been talking about that for quite a few chapters, right? So now we have a question, obviously, because we always have, we learn something and then we have a question on what we learned, which allows us to go deeper, and the cycle continues. So the question is that we have a little bit of a difficulty in understanding or how to look at and appreciate the concept of Torah and mitzvos, right? Because if we're saying that everything is absorbed by and one with Hashem, right? A table, a chair, an animal, anything, everything is one with Hashem. So what makes Torah and mitzvah special, right? What makes that special? If everything is absorbed by Hashem, why are Torah and mitzvahs considered an amazing spiritual experience, a way that we connect with Hashem and become one with him, if everything is one with him, right? So we need to understand what differentiates Torah and mitzvahs from everything else. And we're going to understand this concept by using what we learned last week. What did we spend a lot of time learning last week? We learned the concept of tzimtzum, the concept of diminishment, and we also learned that everything has the amount of diminishment that is in each thing is according to that object, right? So a table is going to have a certain amount of diminishment from Hashem, and a human's going to have a certain amount, animals going to have a certain amount, and plants going to have a certain amount. It's all different. It's all tailor-made, right? So using this concept, we're going to understand what is the difference between Torah and mitzvahs and everything else. Okay? So that's what we're doing in this chapter. Yes. Question.
I don't understand why it takes so much diminishment. Why does it take diminishment from God?
Okay, that's a good question. We will explore that more, but a short answer is that if God were not to hide his face at all, if he was to reveal himself completely, we would cease to exist.
Oh.
We would not be able to exist as separate entities if God's presence was not filtered at all. Because we are not, our physical bodies and even the physical world would not be able to handle that. So God, in order for God to be in this world, he has to kind of hide himself, right? We talked about it being like layers of curtains. He has to hide himself to a certain degree so he can be in this world. Okay. But more and more and more, as we go through the chapters, we understand this concept on a deeper and deeper level, and everything starts to fall into place. Okay. Basically, while Hashem's view, remember we said Hashem's view of the world, he sees the world as not a diminishment, right? The diminishment is only on our end. To God, he sees the world and everything in the world as an extension of himself. Okay? So through God's eyes, nothing's a diminishment. It's only through our perception that we embody a separate existence. Okay? It's only through our lens that we are a separate identity. According to Hashem, we're not a separate identity at all. But Hashem created us in a way that we are able to live as a separate identity and go and move through this world as separate from God. But that's not how God sees it. Okay. And it's not actually the reality. Okay. So, Torah, what we're going to learn is Torah and mitzvos represent the bridge between these two perspectives, right? The perspective between the divine and human. So Torah allows the non-duality of Hashem to become accessible, right? And even in this world of separate, we live in a world of separate consciousness, right? We are going about this world and we live our lives as separate consciousness from Hashem. But Torah is going to bridge that gap between divine and human and help us have this non-dual concept become more accessible. Okay, that's what's going to happen when we learn more about the role Torah mitzvahs play in this world. Okay. So going back, this is going to be a little bit of a memory test. Well, I'm not going to actually test you, but test yourself on what you remember from chapters 4 and 5. Okay. Some of you were here live. Some of you watched the recordings and some of you didn't learn chapter 4 and 5, which is okay because we're going to build on it here and you will be able to understand those concepts. No problem. But in chapters 4 and 5, we learned that Torah and mitzvahs provide a very transcendent, unique merging experience with Hashem. So through Torah and mitzvahs, we merge with Hashem. Now, through mitzvahs, we merge one way, and through Torah, we merge another way. Okay, they each have their unique attributes that allow us to connect to Hashem. Okay, so in this chapter 23, we're going to continue to explore this idea. We're going to take chapters 4 and 5, and we're going to take it one step further and understand it deeper and from a different perspective. Because what I love about Tanya is that it introduces concepts in small bite sizes and what we're ready for. right? So in chapters 4 and 5, we learned about Torah in one way, but we're going to totally expound on that because at chapter 23, we have so much more information under our belt and we're able to handle more and we're able to understand more. So we introduce new concepts. So it's almost like this layering technique that the Tanya uses where we keep on coming back to concepts, foundational concepts that we've learned, but adding new dimensions to it as we are ready. Okay. So the Zohar explains that the connection that occurs to Hashem through mitzvahs with this phrase, the Zohar uses this phrase to help us understand the connection we have to Hashem when we do a mitzvah. Okay. And the phrase is like this: the 248 positive commandments are compared to the 248 organs of a king. Okay. So what we're implying here is that the mitzvos are the innermost divine will and true desire of Hashem. Okay. Now remember, metaphorically, we use physical terms. Doesn't mean Hashem has organs and a body, right? We're using metaphorical terms. We talked about that concept last week and a few weeks ago, right? So we describe mitzvos as the organs of Hashem, right? To emphasize the fact that when we do a mitzvah, it's a pure expression of Hashem himself, okay? So when we do a mitzvah, we are expressing the divine will, right? So mitzvos represent Hashem's inner desire, right? And as it is expressed and dressed in the worlds, right? Okay, so this is what we're going to learn. It doesn't mean that the purpose of the mitzvah is to give the world energy, right? In fact, it's the other way around, right? Hashem wanted us to do mitzvahs, so he created a world so we can do mitzvahs. You're with me? Right? So, and therefore, the created world makes mitzvahs possible. Right? So even like, so it's like a plus B equals C kind of concept. Hashem created the world so we can do mitzvos. Therefore, mitzvos continue to give the world its life force. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not only the fact that the mitzvos are what's keeping the world alive and the mitzvos are sustaining the world. It's more than that. It's the fact that the world was created so we can do a mitzvah. And because of that, the world is sustained through our mitzvahs, through our actions. Okay? So, it's very interesting because the mitzvahs that we do in this world create the life energy of the higher, more spiritual worlds. So the spiritual world's energy is contingent upon what we do in this world. Okay, so the more mitzvahs we do in this world, the greater light and life force shines in the upper, more spiritual worlds. Okay, so we not only, when we are having actions, not only are we affecting our physical world, we are also affecting the higher spiritual realms through our actions. Okay, so now, so what happens is that the whole point of the world is to facilitate Torah and mitzvos, okay? And the world's existence depends on it, right? It's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Here we know. What comes first, one second, is that we needed a world to be able to do mitzvos. Now, the world needs mitzvos in order to exist. Yes, question.
When you talk about the world, you're talking about it as though it's only Jewish. It's only Jews that believe that exist in the world.
No,
What happens to all the other nations? God didn't
Okay.
ask that of them? Or
Okay, so good question. When I talk about the world, I'm talking about this physical world that we live in and everything that exists within this world. The other nations of the world that are not Jewish have their role and how they connect to God, which is, for example, the 7 Noahide laws. That's their connection to God, right? But one of the jobs of the Jewish people is to be a light onto the world. And our job is to make sure that the world continues to exist through our actions and our connection with Hashem. If that would cease to exist, the world would cease to exist. So we're not saying that nothing exists outside of the Jew and outside of the Jewish world. We are saying, though, is that it is our job to be a light onto the nations. It is our job to make sure that the world continues to have its life force. And other nations of the world do that as well, but through their path, right? They don't have the same path as the Jew. They have a different path, which is they have 7 specific laws that they connect to God through, and they are obligated to uphold.
Our God, they connect to our God?
The God. There's only one God, remember?
For us, yeah.
No,
But
for
for
everyone
them,
and everything,
okay.
There's only one God, right? If we were to believe that there are other gods for other nations, that would totally contradict our non-dual concept, right? It would totally contradict the fact that God is everything and nothing exists outside of him, no matter what. So God is the God of all the world. Whether you believe in him or not, that's on you, right?
Whether other nations believe that it's the same God or not is on them.
Exactly.
Correct?
That's
Okay.
on them too, right? But
Okay.
but most religions, well, pagan not so much, but Christianity, Muslim, they believe in the one God. Now, do they believe that there are other things outside of God that also hold powers? Ask them about their religion. But the pinnacle is the God, right? Everything comes from the God. So when we're talking about, back to your question, when we're talking about we're talking about this physical world as it exists in all its dimensions, not just the Jewish world, the whole world. The whole world exists through the power of our actions and our connection through God. Okay. So where were we holding? Okay. Yeah. So the whole point of the world is to be able to facilitate the observance of Torah and mitzvos. Okay. And to connect the question, the non-Jew has their obligations to connect to God through their through the laws that Hashem has made for them, which are the 7 Noahide laws, which we're not going to get into right now, but they do have their way of connecting to Hashem. Okay. So a mitzvah acts as a deep expression of Hashem's infinite light. Okay. And each of these acts cause light and life energy from Hashem, right? In all the other worlds. Meaning, I'm going to explain, meaning the world, remember last week we talked about internal will and external will, right? The means to an end. And we spoke about the alarm clock, right? We said nobody's deep inner desire is to be woken up by an alarm clock, right? But you desire to be woken up by an alarm clock so you can go to work and make money, right? And you go to work and make money because you want to support your family and you support your family, right? There's a lot of external wills to get to your innermost will, right? And the external will is called we look at it as a means to an end, right? So what we're saying here is that the world is God's external will. The world is a means to an end. Having a world is a means to an end. That's an external will. What's the internal will? Mitzvahs is Hashem's internal will, true desire. Hashem's true desire is that mitzvah should be performed, right? How do we make that happen? We have to make that happen in a physical world. So Hashem created a world, which is Hashem's external will, in order to be able to fulfill his internal will, his true desire, which are mitzvahs. Okay, so the world is a means to an end. So that's why the world is sustained through mitzvahs, right? Because it is the sake, it's for the sake of mitzvahs that the world exists. You're with me? Yes. Okay. So, and that's why mitzvahs are compared to organs, right? Because organs are completely surrendered to your soul. Okay, look at your body. Your physical organs and body parts are completely subservient to your soul, which is your brain. Okay, so for example, if you will your hand to move, right? If your brain tells your hand to move, it will move, barring any unusual circumstances, right? There's obviously exceptions to the rule. If somebody, there is such a thing as somebody not able to walk or talk or move, right? But in general, if you will your hand to move, it will move to the point where you don't even have to you're not even registering the concept. Your hand is so subservient to your soul, your will, that it just does its bidding. You don't even have to consciously realize it, right? So that's why mitzvahs are compared to organs. So just like organs are completely subservient to the soul, mitzvahs are completely subservient to Hashem's will, right? Hashem's will is expressed through mitzvahs, right? Our mind's will is expressed through our body, right? So mitzvahs are a direct expression of Hashem's will, right? And in reference to life energy, it's twofold, right? You are basically, it's very, very fascinating, because what happens when you do a mitzvah is you're expressing Hashem's will in many different ways. So for example, the energy a person invests in performing a mitzvah becomes one with Hashem, right? The energy that you're investing, when you put out physical energy to do a mitzvah, that energy becomes a vehicle of expression for Hashem. I'm actually not going to use the word one with Hashem because we're going to talk about that later, but it becomes a vehicle of expression. The energy that you're using is expressing Hashem's will, and the life energy of the object you're using in the performance of the mitzvah also is an expression of Hashem's will. So for example, charity, right? The energy that you're using to give charity becomes one with Hashem. The coin itself is an expression of Hashem's will, right? So your energy becomes it becomes a vehicle of expression, and the actual physical object becomes a vehicle of expression of Hashem's will. Okay, it's pretty cool. Now, as we learned in chapter 4, what did we learn in chapter 4? That the soul has 3 garments. Okay, what are the 3 garments of the soul? Does anybody remember what the 3 garments of the soul are? Barbara, do you remember?
Thought, speech, and action.
Yes, woohoo! Thought, speech, and action. That is the modes of expression, right? We learned that the soul has 10 powers. Whoopie-doo. If the soul has 10 powers but doesn't have a way to express them, what does that help us? So through thought, speech, and action is the way that the soul expresses itself, right? So action is the outermost expression, right? It's the most physical form of expression. And action is absorbed into the mitzvah and becomes the vehicle of expression for the mitzvah. So your action, your garment of the soul, which is your action, becomes the vehicle through which Hashem expresses himself. Do you fathom the incredibleness of this? Right? Like when we do a mitzvah, we are literally becoming containers and catalysts through which Hashem expresses his will.
And he knows each one. He knows, he feels and knows each one that is doing the mitzvah.
Yes. Yes. Each and every thing and action that you do is bringing joy to Hashem, and you're fulfilling his inner will. Remember, the world is his outer will, external will. His inner will is the mitzvahs. So every time you choose to do a mitzvah, you are choosing to express Hashem's will in a very real way. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. We take these big esoteric concepts, but they're actually really practical, right? Because all we have to do right now is once in a while we choose to do a mitzvah, and this is what's happening when we choose to do a mitzvah. When we choose to do any one of these 613 commandments, we are choosing to be the vehicle in which Hashem expresses himself through. Okay, so it's very, very, very powerful. Now, in summary, I want to summarize exactly what a mitzvah does, and then we're going to move on to Torah study. How we merge with Hashem through Torah study is going to be slightly different and slightly more powerful, actually. Okay, so the mitzvah is absorbed into the divine will in 4 different ways. Okay, so A, the life energy of the mitzvah object itself. Okay, B, the energy used by the person doing the mitzvah. Right, you're with me? C, the action garment of the soul. Right, we just said the action garment of the soul is being completely absorbed in the mitzvah. And D, which we add here, we didn't mention before, is the physical limb used to perform the mitzvah. Right, so whether you're using your legs or your hands or your mouth or your eyes, that physical limb is also a direct vehicle of expression for Hashem's will. 4 things. Okay, should I repeat them or we're good? Well, I'm going to repeat them quickly because this is the kind of stuff that I want you to absorb and go home with. Okay, A, the life energy of the mitzvah object itself. B, the energy used by the person doing the mitzvah. C, the action garment of the soul. And D, the physical limb in which you use to perform the mitzvah. Okay, it's quite an all-body experience, right? It's a very all-encompassing experience. Now, example, the hand which gives tzedakah, okay? The mouth which speaks Torah, right? The legs in which you use to run and do a mitzvah, right? Like when we tell our kids, like, oh my goodness, run, use your legs and run and do a mitzvah. Like, this is taking deep Hasidic concepts and relaying it to children. Like, kids, like when you run to do a mitzvah, do you know what you're doing? Even your legs are part of the mitzvah, your arms, your mouth, these are physical things that are becoming a vehicle of expression for Hashem. Okay, and we take these concepts and we pass them on to our children in a way that they too, right? Whoever's been told by their mother the words "rizas," right? Quickly run to do a mitzvah, right? You want to run to do a mitzvah. Now, the sages teach us that our forefathers are, before we get to the concept of Torah, we have one more thing to talk about through mitzvahs, which is going to lead us into Torah. That our sages say that our forefathers are a chariot to Hashem. Okay, our Markava, the forefathers are a chariot to Hashem. Okay, a chariot is completely surrendered to the driver, right? Can't go off on its own. It's to the driver that's doing it, right? And so too, the mind and body of our forefathers were completely subservient to Hashem. What's the difference between our forefathers being compared to a chariot to Hashem and us being compared to a chariot to Hashem when we do a mitzvah? Okay, there is a slight differentiation. Okay, so when we do a mitzvah, only the particular organ in which we're doing the mitzvah with becomes the chariot for Hashem. Okay, and We aren't always doing mitzvahs, right? There's interruption between our mitzvahs. We're not only doing mitzvahs. It'd be nice, but that's just not actually happening. Our forefathers, all the limbs were completely subservient to Hashem because they were always constantly doing mitzvahs, and there was never any interruption of our forefathers were constantly in service of Hashem. Whether they were doing mitzvahs, whether they were praying, whether they were learning, there was no break in their mitzvah observance. So therefore, they were constantly being subservient to Hashem, and all their limbs were involved in the process. For us, it's when we do a mitzvah, the limb that we're using is completely subservient to Hashem. Do you get the subtle difference, right? Our forefathers encompassed that all the time, their whole body. For us, it's when we do a mitzvah and the limb that we're using, that becomes completely subservient to Hashem, like a chariot is to its rider.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yes.
Were the imais also the same as the avos, or was it just the avos?
The phrase is used in connection to the forefathers, but I can very confidently say yes, that the imahos were the same. Absolutely 100%, probably even more. Okay, so now here we go. This is where we're going to transition into Torah study. Yes.
I don't understand chariots.
Chariots.
What
Okay,
is the
so a
chariot? Is it like the
chariot is
vessel?
like a wagon. It's a wagon, right? Like a wagon,
Right.
you imagine like a horse-drawn carriage, right?
Right.
Okay, the carriage, right, where you sit, the chariot part of the carriage can't go anywhere without its rider, right? The chariot doesn't move unless the horses and the rider pull it and tell it to move, right? So what
And
we're
the
saying is that it's
forefathers?
completely subservient to its rider. What?
And the forefathers
And the
were the
just like a chariot, it's completely subservient to its rider. It has no will of its own. A chariot doesn't say, "Oh, I'm going to go to this town by itself without the rider," right? It doesn't have that ability. It has to be pulled by the rider. So too, the forefathers were completely subservient to Hashem's will. They didn't do anything outside of God's will. If
but they
Hashem
were
wanted-
the chariots?
they were the chariots that God's
Okay. They were the chariots.
they were the
Okay.
chariots. They are
All
the
right.
chariots to God's will. Okay.
Sorry.
Now we're going to transition into understanding the concept of Torah study and how we connect to Hashem through Torah study and what's different about it than, okay? And we're going to go back to chapter 5 because if you remember, chapter 5 was all about Torah study. We're going to remind ourselves what chapter 5 was talking about and then go further. Now, I do want to say, in this chapter, we are going to come away with the concept that Torah merges us with God in a much deeper way than mitzvahs, okay? But what I do want you to understand is that everything is relative and in connection to what we are talking about. Later on in the Tanya, we are going to talk about the advantage of mitzvahs over Torah, right? So depending on what we're talking about, sometimes Torah has an advantage over mitzvahs in a particular way, and sometimes mitzvahs have an advantage over Torah in a particular way. So in this chapter, we are going to come away with, oh my gosh, Torah makes us so much more one with Hashem than mitzvahs. Yes, that's true for this particular conversation. Later on, we'll talk about how mitzvahs get us places that Torah doesn't. You're with me? Okay, so in chapter 5, we learned that we learned the connection that we achieve through Torah study. Okay, so Torah study can have even a more profound connection than mitzvahs. Okay, and we're going to discuss this again in this chapter and take it even one step farther because now we have more information and we're able to handle more. Okay, remember what I said. This is a layering process. So we're going to understand this. Yes, we talked about this in chapter 5, but we're going to understand it on a whole new level here in chapter 23. Okay, so Torah engages a deeper part of you. Okay, what's the deeper part that Torah engages? Torah engages our thought and our speech. Now, those are our inner garments. Our action, which mitzvahs employ, is an outer garment. It's way more not superficial, but superficial in the sense that it's a way more physical expression. Thought and speech are inner garments. Obviously, thought is more inner than speech, right? Which we mentioned in the beginning of class to answer our question from last week. But Torah is using the inner garments, thought and speech, okay? So through Torah, your soul is actually merging with Hashem. In contrast to mitzvos, which are subservient but distinct. Okay? Just like the chariot. Does the chariot exist? Does the chariot exist? Yes, it exists, but it exists as a separate entity, right? So why I kept being very careful with my language when I talked about mitzvahs is I always said mitzvahs, we express Hashem's will through mitzvahs, okay? With Torah, we are merging with Hashem's will. Okay?
More direct.
It's a much more, it's a much more, you become one with Hashem's will. With mitzvahs, we are expressing Hashem's will. We are the vehicle in which Hashem's will is being expressed. But when we learn Torah, because we're using thought and speech, which are our inner expressions, we become one with Hashem's will. And we're going to talk about why and how. Okay? But does the distinction make sense to you? Yes. Okay. For the people I can see your face, you're nodding. For the people I can't see your face, I hope you're nodding too. Okay, good. Now, because the part of law, like when we learn halacha, when we learn Hashem's laws, right? When we learn what we're learning is Hashem's thoughts directly. Okay. So, and what are Hashem's thoughts? Hashem's thoughts are his inner desire, right? So when we learn them, we are becoming one with them, right? So again, mitzvahs are an expression of Hashem's will. Torah is Hashem's will. Okay. We're going to understand the differentiation of this even better in a few minutes. Now, I want to give you an example, which really helped me, because while I was preparing, I'm like, okay, yeah, I get it. Expression of Hashem's will is Hashem's will, but what does that mean practically? And it's hard to make a differentiation between these are subtleties, okay? So here's an example that really helps me understand. The example we're using is the mitzvah of an esrog, okay? The mitzvah is that on Sukkot, we take 4 species, right? One of which are an esrog, and we make a blessing on it and we shake it. And this is an expression of Hashem's will, right? Hashem's will is being expressed through this etrog. Remember, if we look back at all the 4 things that are being involved, right? The etrog is being involved. Our hand is being involved. Our energy is being involved, right? All these things are being involved in this mitzvah. Now, if there were no such mitzvah as shaking the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, the etrog would still exist, right? It just wouldn't be an expression of Hashem's will, which means the etrog, to a certain extent, has its own autonomous nature, right? It exists outside of Hashem's will, because if Hashem didn't have this mitzvah, this commandment for us, the etrog would still exist. Okay, so that's the example of a mitzvah, right? The etrog becomes the expression of Hashem's will. Now, take the will itself. What's the will itself? That Hashem wants us to shake the lulav and the etrog on Sukkot, right? If Hashem didn't will this, the idea itself wouldn't exist, right? So if there was no such thing as shaking the lulav and etrog on Sukkot, that concept would cease to exist, right? So the Torah instruction is not just a receptacle in which expresses Hashem's will, it is the will, right? So when you study Torah, that will is creating a deeper union with Hashem. than by just doing the mitzvah. Now, I hesitate to say just doing the mitzvah because obviously that is not the right way to express it. But in connection to this concept, I want to bring home the point that the Torah is a way deeper union because you're connecting with the will himself rather than just expressing the will. Okay? So the Rambam says, which is a concept that is very, very prevalent in Chassidus, which our physical brains really will never be able to totally understand and wrap our brain around it. But the concept is this: at the same time, Hashem is the knower, the power to know, and the knowledge, all wrapped up in one. Us humans can't do that. That doesn't exist for us, right? But to be the knower, the knowledge, and the known, that's Hashem. And when you study Torah, that's what you're becoming one with, all of those things, okay? So mitzvahs can't merge us with Hashem at the highest level, right? Because we're merely an organ, right? Mitzvahs are merely an organ, and also it's performed by an outer garment. Okay, so you see how it's an outer expression? It's more of a outer like expression of Hashem. And Torah is totally one with Hashem, and we study it and we become one with it with our inner garments. Okay? Any questions for now? Okay, one second. There's a question in the chat box. Okay, here. Okay, so can I explain what the knower, the known, and the knowledge is? To the best of my ability. The knower means you're the person who is holding the knowledge, right? If you know something, you're the knower, right? But then Hashem is, once he expresses that knowledge, he's also the knowledge, right? It doesn't, like, we are the knower and the knowledge in our worlds is separate, but it's not separate from him. Okay, so he's the knower, he's the power to be known, and he's the knowledge. All of those things are equally Hashem. Okay, so I hope that explains it a little bit more. And also, do women become, yes, guys, women are equal to men in this concept. Okay, we become just as one with Hashem when we study Torah as men do. Okay, women, which is a totally different concept, might not have as many obligations surrounding Torah study as men, right? But when women study Torah, as we are doing right now, guys, what we are doing right now, we are using our mind and our mouth to study Torah. We are now becoming one with Hashem's will. Simple as that. Now, we're going to address the fact, like, how can we still, okay, we're going to address another concept in a second, but while we are studying Torah, we're using our mouth, we're using our mind, we are becoming one with Hashem's will. Doing other mitzvahs, we're doing external actions only. Yeah, so when we do a physical mitzvah, the cool thing is that Torah is Torah study and a mitzvah, so it's kind of hits the jackpot. But when we do a more physical mitzvah, we are using our action. Okay, which is a more outward expression of Hashem, and the only thing that's becoming united with Hashem is the actual physical limb that's doing the action. Okay, later, in the later 30s of the Tanya, we're going to understand how intention, when we do a mitzvah, does something different to the mitzvah, right? Because you can do a mitzvah without intention. Right? You can do a mitzvah by rote. You can do a mitzvah just because it's what's expected of you. You can do a mitzvah just because that's how you grew up and you don't know any different. But when you add intention to the mitzvah, it does a whole nother thing. But we're going to hold that thought. We're going to get there in a couple chapters. Okay. So now, where was I up to? Okay. So I just gave you the example of the etrog. We understand how Hashem, to the best of our ability, is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. And we understand why mitzvahs can't get us as deeply one with Hashem as Torah. Okay. Now, the innovation that, let me just finish this thought and then you'll answer your question. The innovation between now and when we learned this in chapter 5 is that now we understand the non-dual concept of Hashem. So we're looking at it through the lens of the non-dual concept of Hashem. In chapter 5, what we talked about is that that the Torah merges us and God, two separate entities merging us and Hashem. What we know now is that there were not two separate entities to begin with. We are one with Hashem. What happens when we study Torah is that we become more aware of the fact that we are one with Hashem. But we're not merging two different things together. We are revealing and understanding that this was never separate to begin with. Okay, that's what we add in chapters 23. In chapter 5, we didn't talk about the non-duality of Hashem. We were not there yet, right? We were busy uncovering and discussing foundational concepts. Now in chapter 23, and we spent a long time discussing the non-duality of Hashem, now we see it through a Torah lens. Okay, yes, question.
Where I wanted to know was actually somebody wrote down in the chat box as well. They wanted to know, are we learning Torah right now?
Yes, we're learning Torah right now. This is what we're doing. As we're learning about this concept of connecting to Hashem's innermost will through Torah, we are doing it. Okay, so right now, this whole hour that you're spending, hopefully I won't go over time because I have still so much more to say, but however long this class is, this is what we're doing. We actually are practicing what we preach right now. Okay, so obviously we have a couple questions, right? Now, what contains, okay, I want you to think about this, okay? What contains a higher disclosure of Hashem? What reveals Hashem more, okay? Is Hashem more revealed in the higher spiritual worlds? Or is Hashem more revealed here in this lowest world as it's manifested through Torah? Okay? I'm going to tell you the answer, and we're going to understand why in a second. The answer is, in this world through Torah, Hashem is expressed way more powerfully and deeply than the higher spiritual worlds. Okay? If the higher spiritual worlds and Torah are both compatible with Ein Sof, right? They're both expressing Hashem's infinite light in some respect. Why is Torah a greater representation of the infinite light of Hashem than the higher world? So we ask the question, which one expresses it more? The higher world or Torah? We say Torah. So why? If they're both Ein Sof compatible, right? For example, then why is Torah giving us a better and deeper connection to Hashem? Okay. The answer is because when the divine soul and the garments are immersed in Torah, the divine will is fully disclosed. Whereas in the upper worlds, only what's revealed is only what is drawn out of the life force of the Torah. So it's like a secondary revelation. The spirituality that's in the higher world is a spirituality that comes through the life force of the Torah. And it's a secondary emanation, okay? Hashem uses the energy of Torah to create the worlds, and the world only exists for the sake of Torah, okay? So the light is a secondary, not primary energy. The primary thing is the Torah. The light coming through the Torah is a secondary energy. Now, the concept of light that's called Sovev Kol Almin. It's a light that surrounds the world. Okay, there's Mamale and there's Sovev. There's a light that fills the world and there's a light that surrounds the world. The light that surrounds the world because it's not compatible with the world. It's too lofty. It doesn't exist. It can't come into the world. It has to only see the world, right? When we learn Torah, guys, this is crazy. When we learn Torah, offers a full disclosure of Hashem's light. Okay. There's no such thing as surrounding and encompassing. It's everything. So when we learn Torah, we are revealing, there's no hint. You know how we said there's Tzimtzum in this world and God has to hide his face? When we learn Torah, there is no hiding of God's face. It is everything. Okay. So the other worlds can only handle the amount of spirituality that it can handle. Right? So Atzilus, the highest world, can handle a certain amount, and then a less amount is Bria, and the less amount is Yitzira. But when we learn Torah in this world, there is no limitations. There's no encompassing light. It's all light. It's all Hashem's light. So when we learn Torah in this world, we are actually revealing a more intense, greater light than the highest spiritual worlds. Yeah? Amazing. So here comes the question. If while we're learning Torah, this is such an amazing revelation of light, how do we not expire? How do we live through it? Right? Because Carrie's question in the beginning was, why do we need Tzimtzum to begin with? Why do we need a diminishment of God's light to begin with? And the answer I gave was because we wouldn't be able to exist in this revelation of God's light without any coverings. So how could we exist when we study Torah and we're becoming one with this infinite light, and there's no Tzimtzum, there's no hiding of God's face when we learn Torah? How do we live through it? Right? It's a very good question. And the answer is Hashem creates the universe in such a way that when we are learning Torah and we are basking in this infinite light, our physical self is unaware of it. Okay? It's unaware of this amazing influx of light that happens through study of Torah. Because if it would be aware, we would not survive. So what is happening is a subconscious experience. Now, anyone who's been in the therapeutic world can tell you how powerful a subconscious experience is. We are driven, we are molded by our subconscious experiences. Our behaviors, we can say, I don't know why that is a trigger for me. I don't know why I'm affected by this. It's because of your subconscious. It has such a higher understanding than our conscious. So when we learn Torah, our subconscious is being exposed to this infinite amount of light. We are unaware of it on a practical level because we would not survive it. But does that mean it's not having an effect? And does that mean it's not crazy powerful? It's even more powerful because our subconscious is way more powerful than our conscious. And the reason it has to exist in our subconscious is because we still want to live. Hashem still wants a world to exist. He doesn't want to wipe us out by his spirituality. Yes.
Why would we not survive it? I don't understand.
Because when there is such an amazing revelation of spirituality and we are physical humans, physicality cannot survive under such immense spirituality light if it's experiencing it in real time. Okay. It's like, for example, it's like being in the presence of the sun. If you were in the presence of the sun without any filters, you would burn up. Right? So same thing with God. If you were in the presence of God without any filters, without any coverings, we would cease to exist. We would burn up. Right? When we learn Torah, our subconscious is being exposed to this spiritual light. But it's our subconscious, not our conscious, or else we would burn up. Okay? Let that concept sit for a minute. Think about it. By the way, this is going to be a source of a meditation, right? Later on, these are meditation practices. This is not something that I expect you to be like, whoa, I understand this completely the first time you hear it, right? This is like we talk about it. The more we talk about it, the more we understand it. We are eventually, we're talking about God here, so we're never going to actually understand it completely. Just remember that, okay? So our subconscious is experiencing this amazing revelation of godly light when we learn Torah. The reason why we are not able to experience this in our conscious is because it would kill us. Just like, for example, we actually experienced this physically at the giving of the Torah. What happened? We mentioned this, I think. I don't remember. I give 2 Tanya classes, so sometimes I don't remember what I say where. But the first 2 commandments at Har Sinai was said by God himself. What happened? We died. After each of those commandments, we did not survive it because it was too great of a revelation for our physical bodies to experience. Okay, so we know what it means to like not survive the physical expression of God, right? That's why it needs to be a subconscious experience. But don't discount our subconscious experience. They shape who we are. They shape us. They inform our actions and our beliefs. Everything is formed by our subconscious. Okay, so just know that it's super powerful when we are affecting our physical body and mind through subconscious when we're studying Torah. Obviously, it has conscious ramifications as well, but the extent of the revelation of God is a subconscious experience. Okay, so how do we take this all to heart? This is how I'm going to end. I have 4 minutes. And then we'll do a very fast meditation. I'm so sorry we're going over. I'm telling you, this chapter is very long. It took me many hours to prepare because it's very long. But we're doing well. We're getting it done. Now, how do we take this stuff to heart? Because Tanya is not meant to be an encyclopedia. It's not just meant to give you knowledge and just to have knowledge. It's meant to be practical. Okay, so what do we do? Basically, the Tanya says, in the Tanya's words, it says, if we were wise, right? We would take all these concepts and we would meditate on them, right? And we would meditate on the concept of how everything we learned today, right? How our brain and our mouth are expressions of godliness, how we become one with Hashem when we learn Torah and all the reasons why, and we understand the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, right? And we would contemplate on these concepts, right? And then the Tanya adds one more point. It says, the last point that Tanya adds that we can contemplate on is that Hashem commands us to, it says in the sages say, Hashem commands us to perform these laws in order to revere him. That seems completely opposite of what we've been saying, right? Doesn't it? It seems like the cause and effect are backwards here, right? Surely we first revere Hashem and that is our motivation to do mitzvahs, right? And here we learn that there's 2 levels of reverence. The first level of reverence is a basic level of reverence, which is necessary to inspire you to observe the mitzvahs. Okay? Basic level of reverence is that we revere Hashem, and that allows us to observe, that encourages us to observe the mitzvahs. The higher level of reverence is something that follows after we perform the mitzvahs. Then we have an additional higher reverence of Hashem, right? This higher level of reverence can only be reached through meditation. Okay, so it goes like this. We revere Hashem. It causes us to do mitzvahs. Now, if we were to meditate, number 1, on the mitzvah that we're doing and on the reaction of what happens when we do a mitzvah, that is then going to produce a higher level of reverence for Hashem. Okay, that can only happen through meditation. And not only that, the meditation is a pretty abstract concept. Okay, when we meditate on Hashem, we're meditating on abstract ideas, right? Not all brains are created equal to internalize these abstract concepts. So what the Tanya wants you to know is that if, when you meditate, you are not getting anywhere in this concept, just know that your service of Hashem is not dependent on it. And everything that you're doing is still extremely worthwhile. And you shouldn't give up because there's a lot of different ways to meditate. Okay. And the next chapter is going to, and this is what we're going to discuss in the next chapter. If I were to put a topic on it, which the Tanya does here, it says, don't be delusional, right? Don't think that if you're having a hard time with these meditation concepts, don't think that means that your service of Hashem is worthless. Okay, that's what we're gonna get into, segue to next chapter. But what we're ending with is the fact that these concepts, if we were wise, we would take everything we learned and meditate on them, which will then produce an additional higher level of reverence for Hashem. This takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. If you're hitting a wall, don't worry. First of all, we'll troubleshoot it. There's a whole 10 chapters of Tanya that are troubleshooting chapters. What happens if ... right? So don't worry, we'll troubleshoot it, but also know that while you're working on it, your service of Hashem is equally valuable. So don't get discouraged if your meditation is you're hitting a wall when you're trying to meditate on these very abstract concepts. Remember, we're trying to make abstract concepts to create real emotions. That's a very, very, very intense thing to try to do. Okay, and that's how this chapter ends. 1 o'clock on the money. Well, 1 o'clock for me, 2 o'clock for you, but okay, we're gonna go a little over because we're gonna meditate quickly, but any questions before we get to meditation? Okay, we're gonna meditate. If there's something that comes up after meditation, let me know. I'm gonna make it shorter because I really value your time, and I appreciate you taking an hour of your day to do this with me. I want to end with a quick meditation because I think that's really grounding. If you have to leave, I understand, but let's do this. Let's do this. Okay, everybody take a deep breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Follow the rhythm of your breath. Don't try to do anything that your body doesn't want to do. Just natural rhythm. We're going to take a couple breaths, and when we get to like a little bit more of a like calm, relaxed state, I'm going to share with you some of the concepts that I want you to go home with, okay? Basically, I'm going to give you little snippets of what we talked about in little snippet forms, okay? And then you can meditate on them, think about them, come back next week with any questions. Mitzvahs are God's deepest inner will. They are the very reason the world is here. Take a second to think about that. When you observe a mitzvah, A, your soul's garment of action, B, the limb of your body that you used, C, the energy that you used, and D, the energy of the object you used, all connect directly with Hashem, like a chariot to its rider. Okay? The connection of a mitzvah to Hashem is like the connection between a chariot to a rider, completely subservient, but still separate. Torah study merges your inner garments of thought, speech, and your soul itself with God in total unity. In Torah, there is no hiding of God's face. Okay, there's no symptom, there's no diminishment in Torah study. So when you learn Torah, it's a complete merging. Okay, and the last concept I want to leave you with is that your conscious mind doesn't perceive God's light in the Torah. Otherwise, you would expire. You would cease to exist when studying it. Okay, it's a subconscious experience which shape us. Okay, those are the main concepts that we learned today. They're big, they're deep and practical, right? Everything we learned today was so deep, but so practical. So practical that we're doing it right now, right? So bring your attention back to your breath. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Relax your body. I probably like hyped you up because I'm super hyped up. So just like calm your body. Any tension you might have, just let it melt away. Take these amazing thoughts with you throughout your week. And I will see you here next week, same time. Thank you guys for coming. I know it's the summer, but I think it's really great to be consistent, and whoever can't be here will listen to the recording. and have a wonderful, wonderful week.